Good afternoon, everybody, and happy procurement month. The month of March, as we all know, is procurement month. And I just wanted to share a quote with everybody. The first thing I want to talk about is kind of the importance of procurement and what we do. So about this meeting, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of procurement, our dashboard, potential tariffs, and then we'll get into the good stuff, which is the increase in delegation, our IT purchasing manual getting updated, and then how to process items below your delegation. We were going to cover statewide IT contracts this month, but with the change in delegation, I thought it would be important to change this and pivot a little bit and talk about the delegation and how it will impact everybody. I also want to put in a plug for Melinda Williams. She's offering a monthly IT Procurement 101 training, and we're proactively using the procurement dashboard to track procurements and to give you a higher level of service as you process procurements or your IT procurements. Before we get any further, though, I want to thank the statewide IT procurement team. You know, very often the job we do is thankless. And every day I'm impressed by their knowledge of procurement. They mostly hear criticism. We mostly just hear, hey, this procurement, it's stuck, or where is it? Or we hear the bad things. But I know every day they're doing the best they can to try to help the state with IT purchases. And a lot of the work they do goes unrecognized. But I know that they're absolutely doing their best to offer great customer service. And that includes the DIT agency procurement team. And I also want to include all of you for attending this meeting because it shows a dedication on your part to get better at procurement, to achieve excellence in procurement, and to better all of us for the good of the state. Either you're in procurement or you're involved with procurement if you're looking at this video. And I just want to tell you that what you do is appreciated, and every day we can tell stories on how we've helped the state achieve better outcomes. So the value of procurements and why. So some of the good stuff is we get government savings and we process a whole lot of money, $13 million, the global value of public procurement. And then there's ways to optimize your IT procurement process. And then we're also, you know, sometimes people say the thing that we do in procurement is as long as we keep ourselves out of the paper, we've done our job. So what are some of the things when we get in the paper? Well, if we don't do a good job in IT public procurement, we're going to have data breaches. We're going to get hacked. We're going to have systems that get shut down. And procurement in general, we're there to prevent fraud and to make sure taxpayers get the best value for their dollar. So March is National Procurement Month, and we should share the value that we bring to taxpayers and to the people we work for every day. I'll let everybody just read this for a second. I usually don't show slides like this, but I think this slide is pretty impactful. And I'll highlight the key part. The secretary of any agency shall be personally liable for the cost of any contract that's not done in accordance with state procurement rules and laws. That's pretty impactful, and I don't know if everybody knows that, but our job as procurement people is to make sure that this does not happen to the secretary of our agency. And I know that's important for all of them. And in order to prevent this from happening, for IT procurements, we have a 10-step procurement process because IT procurements involve reviews by EPMO, security, privacy. We'll have AI reviews at some point, legal, architecture. All of those get involved in this 10-step process, which can be kind of confusing. This 10-step process has led to our dashboard, which I talked about last month. So the one key highlight I want to show is after last month, we were at about 78% of procurements. Now we have 91.74% of procurements on schedule. At one point last week, we got up to 95% of procurements on schedule. And it does require us to change some dates, though. So when we change those dates, we are going to start reaching out aggressively to let you know, hey, this date is getting changed. Your CIO should know the date got changed, and we can figure out why the date got changed and how we can prevent future dates from getting changed. Statewide, we have 9 procurements right now that are behind schedule. These are the 9 procurements. There's only a few agencies that have them behind schedule. So you all can go into the dashboard and see what deadlines you have coming up for your procurements and where your procurement is. I wanted to talk a little bit about tariffs. One of the key IT hardware pieces that we buy is our hardware, and it's very possible the statewide contract will be impacted by tariffs. The vendors on that contract have the ability to ask for an unanticipated tariff increase, to have that be a result of as an increase in pricing. As of the last time I talked to Debbie Patterson, who's our strategic sourcing manager, no vendor has come forth with that request yet, but they have been asking about it. Tariff that's going to be there for a while. I fully expect one or more of the hardware vendors to ask for a price increase to reflect that tariff. From the point they ask us, we'll have 30 days notice before they can implement that tariff increase. So I tell you this because right now would be a good time to reach out to your agency and let them know. And maybe, the way everything is unpredictable right now, I would plan your end of year purchases for computer hardware right now and get it done as soon as possible. That way you don't have to scramble with that 30-day notice if a tariff does get put into place.
Hey, James, I'm going to just weigh in real quickly to back that up for you. So this is for the IT Volume Purchase Award for these tariffs. And so it's going to be your laptops, your monitors, your options, desktops, workstations, things of that nature. I have been contacted directly by some of the vendors who are in the process now of getting the paperwork together on these tariff increases, and it is very fluid. Things made in China went from 10 to 20%. Things manufactured in Mexico or that tariff just went in at 25%. So from what I'm seeing, the biggest impact is going to be out of China will be laptops and monitors and some of the options, and pretty much all of them are making their workstations and desktops in Mexico, and that's a 25% increase. So as James said, if you can go ahead and order once they make the request and an amendment's done, we have basically a 30-day price protection. So really between now and mid-April, if you have those types of orders, I would strongly encourage that you get them placed.
Thank you. So delegations, first with the IT purchasing manual, give us a little time. We will have to update our purchasing manual. One thing I wanted to highlight, currently our purchasing manual says the delegation benchmark is 25,000, and we will change that to 100,000, which is right there. So we'll cover that part, but it's going to take us a little bit of time to update the purchasing manual. And the highlighted part, I'm going to read it out for us. The general delegation establishes the maximum, keyword is maximum, authorized dollar limits for IT purchases of goods or services for an agency without statewide IT procurement office approval. We have had some agencies that contacted us and were, really wanting us to help them with procurements. And so the rule is you can, the maximum amount that you're authorized not to utilize us is 100,000. But if you have a procurement that, is somewhere up in that threshold and you want to get the statewide review as we previously have given it, then you can go ahead and put it in the system. Probably the trick is going to be you have to put the cumulative value of the contract at 100,000. Also, we have to update Ariba, and that will take a little bit of time. We'll have to reach out and get that done through Ariba. We'll send an email out when we do get it updated, so that when you go into the Ariba sourcing tool, it will change the routing for procurements over 100,000 and procurements under 100,000. And I'll talk a little bit more about the value in just a moment of what the 100,000 means versus yearly amount are cumulative, and it will be a cumulative amount. The other part of the purchasing manual, our purchasing manual, that is that if it's under 100,000, then it's the responsibility of the agency, and that's if you don't seek our guidance, and you need to, as an agency, establish written procurement policies and procedures under the delegated authority. So now, for anything over 100,000, we would be looking to do a sealed competitive bid, but it's going to depend on your thresholds that's in your procurement manual on what you need to do for purchases under 100,000. That 100,000 just sets the threshold that NCDIT purchasing department has to review your procurements. I will share the memo that was sent out from Secretary Piccioni. And this is, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but these slides will be available after the presentation. And then this way you have the memo in one place. But if you ever need to go back and look at it, but this just indicates that we are able to raise the limit up to the limit established by the Secretary of the Department of Administration. And so that is essentially what we did. The new IT limit is 100,000 for the cumulative value of the contract. This aligns with P&C. It's been granted to all agencies. Now, I know under the P&C limit, there's a process you have to go through to get your limit raised to 100,000. But for IT purchases, the Secretary has allowed all agencies to have $100,000 cumulative value. Similar to P&C, the value of the contract includes all renewals and extensions. So to make this clear how it works, I'll touch on a couple of scenarios. So a 3-year contract for $33,000 yearly would be under the benchmark, because obviously that's $99,000. If the agency then needs to extend the contract for an additional year, then it would need to be reviewed by statewide IT procurement. So upon that renewal, you would have to send it for review through statewide. A 3-year contract for $25,000 yearly value with the option for 2 extensions would have a cumulative value of $125,000 and would be over the benchmark. A 1-year contract for $51,000 would obviously be under the benchmark. If the agency seeks a 2nd year of the contract, that would be subject to statewide review. One of the important things to remember is this: per NC administrative code rules, we shall not, it's similar to when you use a P card, you shouldn't divide the requirements into smaller purchases to keep them under the general IT delegation or benchmark. So in another way, what that is saying is, if you just keep doing 1-year contracts to avoid procurement rules or to not send it to statewide, that could be an issue per that administrative code. Now, we already looked at the 10-step process again. I'm bringing it back up because as we look to see how agencies, and to give you some guidance on how you will need to process items under 100,000, we can align with the 10-step process we already have in procurement. And so this is here for your reference, but also we'll go through what each step means. So in the first step, you have to get EPMO approval. So I'll just reiterate once more that what the change in the benchmark does, or the delegation, is it just does not require the review from statewide IT procurement, but you are still subject to all the other reviews, which includes project management, security, privacy, legal reviews. All of that you are still required to do. You just need to document it into your procurement sourcing file. And then statewide IT procurement will not be there to review what you've done to make sure you've checked all the boxes. So the first step of the 10-step process, and this is where we can streamline it a bit, because in some cases, there's no reason for us to be doing duplicate work in these smaller contracts. So that's what we're trying to do for you. So I'll show you where, steps that just are completely omitted. But the first step is you still have to make sure or get verification whether or not it's an IT project. If you go to the general statute, I just copied down some of the key features, but this is what they use to determine if it's a project management. But it's covered in general statutes that you need to see whether or not it's an IT project. And if it is, then it needs to be submitted through project management. Notice that there's this piece regardless of cost. So I've been told that it could be a $0 procurement, but it still might be a project. But we have an excellent project management team. They have an excellent web page. So what you need to do is just link to the project management web page. When you go to that site, there's a place that you can start their process. And if it's not a project, then it's real easy. You'll have the documentation that you can include in your procurement that this is not an IT project. But if it is a project, then you'll get, you can go down the IT project management timeline and include that as you go through your procurement. Now, here's where we get some streamlining and some savings. So step 2, that's the opportunity to meet with all of DIT. That's not applicable when you're doing it as your agency. And then step 3, you should already have your approval from the CIO. So those 2 steps are streamlined when you're doing the procurement on your own. Step 4 is where it gets to be a little bit more, I could see where it could be more challenging, but that's where, as an agency procurement person, you need to develop and review the solicitation document. I have a link on this page where you can, if you haven't seen it before, and I'm sure most of you have, where you can go to the IT procurement website, our forms and templates, and that's where you can get the latest and greatest form template to use as you fill out your procurement documents. And you want to make sure you choose the correct template. RFP, RFP Lite, and RFQ, IFB, you need to get the right template. And then you also need to make sure you include the correct legal terms. So you're going to have to know whether your solution is on-prem, cloud services, whether it's software or hardware. All of those could involve different legal terms and conditions that you need to include in your template. And Andrea is going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. That's going to be one of the key things that you need to do. One thing to remember, we talked about this already, but you need to follow your agency purchasing guidelines. So if your threshold is 25,000 and anything over 25,000, you need to seek a sealed competitive bid. Then you should be doing an RFP. If you change your agency guidelines and it's 50,000 or whatever it is, that will be your compass for how you should procure items that are under 100,000. And then as a recommendation, your legal team should review the solicitation before you send it out. And this could prevent issues later. So we always recommend sending it to the legal team during this part, because the last thing you want is not to have your legal team get it, and then you find out you used the wrong document or you didn't include the right legal terms, and then the vendor sends it back to you, and then you got to backtrack on your contract. That is an issue that could happen. Andrea, you can talk a little bit, if you like, about how they can determine what legal terms to use and handle that part.
Thank you, James. I'm honored to be here and talk about this. We do, in general, when it comes to an IFB/RFQs, we typically have 3 sets of templates. They were generated before things were ever put into the cloud. So always remember that the templates that we have that are combine everything that are on the website, as well as in the Ariba sourcing tool, as well as we have them in our SharePoint site. All of those standard templates have on-prem terms and conditions, okay? If you find that what your agency business owner wants is a cloud solution or vendor hosted solution, you will always want to make sure you add the, we call them the SaaS terms and conditions. It's kind of really like a misnomer though. It's anything in the cloud, anything vendor hosted, you should have those terms and conditions in. Now, why do we need that? And why is that so important? Well, the biggest difference between the on-prem, where we're hosting the information and the state data, and the cloud application where the vendor is hosting the state data is that the terms and conditions have a lot more stringent constraints and requirements related to security, and as we go down the road, privacy and so forth. So it is very important to always understand what your agency business owner needs, clearly specify, is it on-prem or not? Now, once you figure that out, my biggest suggestion is making sure the rest of your document is consistent with that on-prem or whatever. I remember working on something with an agency, and I didn't clearly indicate whether it was on-prem or not. I didn't ask the agency business owner. The IFB went out, and we got a mishmash of responses. Some were on-prem, some were in the cloud, and I guess I just wasn't smart enough at the time to figure that out. So I would highly recommend, the biggest mistake you can make is not putting in like the, we call it Section 18, which is in the SaaS set of terms and conditions. You should put those in for your vendor hosted solutions. And as I was getting to before, we have 3 IFB RFQ templates. One is for software maintenance. We rarely use that one. You may use it more than we do. We at SITP had rarely used that one. The other 2 are pretty good. And the first one, and sometimes people have a tendency to use this one too much, but it's for goods, software, and services. Okay, and that is going to have things in there like Energy Star and recycle and things. In other words, if you're buying, anything in a system where like it's a pipette system or microscopes, electronic microscopes or whatever, if you're buying goods, you've got to make sure it's best practice to use the goods software and support or services. And if you're just buying like for the first time software and software support or maintenance or whatever, just go with the software and software support. The way you determine what template you have, you read that very first paragraph on page 1 where that vendor actually signs it when they submit. So those are the key things. And I want you to just remember that, again, if it's on-prem or in the cloud, you should always make sure your specs are consistent with one or the other, that your F&D chart is consistent with one or the other, and those terms and conditions. All those 3 things have to align in your security specs.
Thank you, Andrea.
Okay.
For folks on the call, if you feel like you will need more training in that area, please let us know, and we can do a specialized training for specifically that. To kind of overview, so in step 4, the SITP review is not required now. So that is what the memo did. It took away that SIPO review. Your ESRMO review, you do that by going to the ESRMO PTA page. It's probably best to have your security person with you there when you complete that. And then you want to include documentation of the ESRMO approval in your procurement file. You also want to include documentation of privacy approval in your procurement file. And then I put this because everything we see is becoming AI. It's the hottest topic. It's been the hottest topic for a year now, right? We at the statewide or at DIT, we just have hired and will be onboarding a new AI leader, or I think it's a deputy chief, but a new person to lead our AI approach for the state. So I anticipate that there will be some type of required AI approval in the future because it's getting to be a bigger and bigger issue. So we can anticipate that. And then you should include your agency legal review. Over COVID, we saw a lot of documents that were completed and signed without a legal review. And going back to what we looked at the beginning, I do not recommend that. We need to, as part of procurement professionals, we have to make sure that our due diligence is done with the legal review. And then you document the EPMO review. That's only if it's a project. If it's not a project, then you do not have to worry about that. Other reviews could be required. Usually you'll get notified of that kind of through EPMO or through ESRMO, and that could be architecture, identity, access management, etc. So that covered step 4 of the procurement process. Now we're on to step 5 and 6. Steps 5 and 6 are where the procurement is sent out. Either if it's an RFP, it's sent out through EVP and published publicly. An RFQ should be sent out. It's recommended best practice to use the EVP system to send out the RFQ. In some cases, we have emailed them, and we're trying to get using the EVP system, because that gives us an audible practice of how we received the response from the vendor. Either way, that occurs in step 5. At the end of step 5, you should have the vendor's offer to review, or multiple vendors' offers to review. So step 6 is where you're evaluating the vendor's offer, and that's where you need to come out of step 6. You should have a well-written, organized draft award recommendation, and that's important if your award is challenged. So we always recommend start on your award recommendation, at least the draft of it, early in the process, and you can continually add to it. And if your procurement goes before the courts, if a vendor challenges it, that award recommendation is key for us to defend the state, or for your legal team to defend the state, or even for you to defend the state. Because usually, and at times, it doesn't get challenged for it could be a year or two before it's challenged, or before an auditor is asking questions about that procurement. So it's good to have a well-documented award recommendation so you can answer the auditor's questions. Obviously, if it's a vendor, usually they're going to protest right away, and you want that in good shape to turn over to your legal team. Utilizing the state's contract templates is required based on general statute. So resist the temptation to use vendor paper. Now, step 7, that's going to involve some operational reviews by your legal team and by the NCDIT operational review. And it's pretty much the same as in step 4. So you're going to have your ESRMO review. So in step 4, they're just reviewing the solicitation to make sure that part is okay. In step 7, they're reviewing the actual award. So you're going to have an ESRMO review, which is security, that is privacy. It could include AI, but that's where you'll take your privacy threshold analysis form and update it. And if you go to this link that is in the presentation, you can see where you can update your PTA form in that link. And then you want your agency to review the final award. So that's where you go back to them, and now you actually have the company name in there. There's 2 types of things that legal usually has. There's business risk, which might not be recommended, but you can sign off on. And then there's contracts that don't comply with North Carolina law. So we've seen a number of contracts that were done during COVID that came through. So a few of them had stipulations that allowed our data to be sent to foreign countries or overseas. I can remember at least one that indicated that the contract was covered by Canadian law. We're not allowed to agree to either of those. We're not allowed to agree to jurisdictions outside of the state of North Carolina. So like we said, here's the ESRMO review, and then the agency legal review. So remember, in their review, they're going to tell you whether it complies with North Carolina law. And as we said earlier, we can't just say, well, it doesn't apply with, we have to agree to the terms of California as a jurisdiction, but we're okay with that because that would not necessarily, I'm not an attorney, but I don't think that would be considered a business risk. But if your attorneys sign off on it as a business risk, well, that's, they're the legal professionals. But if they advise you that it's against North Carolina law, I would not recommend signing off on that. So you're going to have your business risks that your leadership can sign off on, and then your North Carolina law infringements that you need to negotiate with the vendor. Usually, if you let them know that this is against North Carolina law, they'll often work with you to make sure you can have a contract that complies with our law. If it's a project, you would have an EPMO review. And if it is a project, we'll talk about that next. If it is a project, an OSBM review is also required right before you make the contract award. And they're going to want to know all your budget numbers, and they need to sign off on it before you sign the contract. And that is part of that would be part of step 9. But steps 8, 9, and 10, this is where you kind of consolidate them when you're doing it as an agency. And that's where you need to document your negotiations and BAFOs. Andrea?
I can definitely address that. I believe that, if you need to incorporate an existing vendor agreement or have negotiations that you need to do with your vendor, of course, you're going to memorialize those in a BAFO and incorporate that. I think the key thing is to ensure that your award recommendation covers that you did add that extra step. There are award recommendation templates that are in the Ariba sourcing library and on the website. So those should be able to help you with that. I think agency legal team. Yeah. And James, I'll let you handle the rest, but BAFO is your standard process with the BAFO. Usually what I just see is you just have to make sure you incorporate that into memorializing the process in the award recommendation.
And so in step 7, we got an NCDIT review, but then we kind of changed the contract through the BAFO process and through negotiations in step 8 or 9, if we have to do it. If we're lucky, you don't have to have any negotiation in BAFOs. That occurs 10% of the time. It seems like it's rare. I'm sure it occurs more than that, but it seems most of the time, and the ones we really notice are the ones where we have these intense negotiations with vendors. So what happens is the contract that was reviewed in step 7 is no longer the actual contract. So now you have to go back through step 7 and have all the security and project management folks look at it again to make sure they're okay with any changes that were made. Usually that's not, too hard to do, but it just depends on the changes. But you want to make sure you go back through and get their reapproval and their final sign off on your final contract. Then you just need to have that documented and keep that in your procurement file. So that covers change or the increase in the benchmark that was established. And and so I just wanted to touch base so everybody was clear that what that increase actually meant. It meant that statewide procurement, we will just need to review the ones over 100,000. And if you need some help or training really as an agency for items below that, we can arrange some training for you. Is Melinda Williams on the call? I wanted to see if she could touch base on her Procurement 101 training.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. We do have our IT Procurement 101 available. It's the first Tuesday of every month from now until October, and it will be held in our conference room at what everybody knows is the Red Roof Inn. We are also working on developing a virtual one. However, it takes a little bit more resources to do that. So I am working on that one, and we will be rolling out additional trainings here in the future. But as of now, we have the IT Procurement 101. And as James did state several times, that we can do customized training based on your agency's needs. I still do one-on-one training.
And can you also give a plug for our presentations we'll be giving at the Peak Conference?
We are actually having some very exciting presentations this year. We have AI, as James mentioned. That's really a hot topic in the IT community. So Keith Briggs, Sarah Roby, and Lauren Clemens will be doing a AI presentation as to how do we navigate AI in our IT procurement process. And then we have Andrea Pacina and Sarah Civic, which will be doing a presentation on our terms and conditions on how to navigate those in the IT procurement process. And then James and myself, along with members from the PGT team, will conduct a breakout session that goes over the dashboard. And that segment is called A Day in DIT. A Day in IT Procurement. Day standing for dashboards, automations, and enhancements. And we will go in a little bit of detail about the dashboard, explain the automations and the enhancements that have been made a part of our side of the sourcing tool. So you might get a lot of emails from the robot, and you may see that some of your items are closed manually. And if you look in your task history, you'll see that sometimes you'll get messages from SVP Ariba, which is our robot. So we'll discuss that, and we'll also give you tips and tricks of how to make sure that you stay out of the red or with your sourcing projects. That will result in a lot less communication from the robot and us reaching out to you saying, hey, can you give us an estimated date? So we'll show you some tips and tricks to make sure that you are properly closing out your task in the sourcing tool.
Very good. Thank you, Mel. Okay, so the memo that came out also had 3 additional memos. So the first one was the blanket approval of contract renewals. And that's pretty straightforward. We've kind of been doing this anyway at Statewide on a case-by-case basis, but it'll just make it a little bit more forward. So what you need to do is, let's just say you do a 3-year contract with 2 renewals, then you should include that. You should include this memo in your renewal showing that you had a blanket approval to approve it. And I'll just read this because it's self-explanatory. Those options may be exercised without prior approval if those options do not modify the existing terms of the agreement. So if you're adding additional scope, if anything's changing, you do need to put it through as an amendment to get an approval. But if it's the same exact contract, you're just using your option to do year 4 and year 5, you do not need to submit it through Statewide for those renewals. So that should be really helpful for all of us. Just include that memo in your procurement file indicating why you did not, just to document it. So the next one was the hosting exceptions memo, and I'll let Andrea take over this one.
What I understand, the hosting exceptions, if you have an existing system and that system has already been approved within the last 12 months, there is no need to resubmit a hosting exception unless something has changed in the environment or you're moving the state data or whatever. If you have new software that's being hosted, outside of whatever, you would just follow the normal procedure. You would put in a hosting exception and then they would approve it. Now, I do have to say that a term approval of a hosting exception was always a misnomer because it got to the point where we all know that majority of the hosting exceptions were approved. It's not that we were to approve them. It's just that the state originally wanted to understand DIT, I should say, originally wanted to really understand where all their data was housed. In any kind of emergency, they would be able to, at the touch of a button, understand where all the data was and with who and whatnot. So, I mean, it wasn't like, oh, we're going to grant you approval. It was more just like a recording thing. As such, they changed the rules such that Again, if you have an existing system, you're no longer having to do those repetitive, I have to renew my hosting exception annually, unless there's some kind of change in your system. If it is new software, you will do the same thing. And I think the same thing holds for PTA's privacy threshold analyses too.
Memo number 4 is the PTA submissions memo.
Okay, so from what I'm hearing on the PTAs is that one, they've dovetailed them a little bit better with some of the larger projects. That is a better thing, and they're not doing it at different times. The other thing is again, similar to the hosting exceptions, if there are no changes to the PTA, you're no longer going to be required to complete a new one during every year, which is great. However, there is now a simple way where if you do have a change related to who's accessing the data, where it lives, anything of that, your security liaison or whoever normally fills out your privacy threshold analysis, they can press a button that just says, okay, here is my old number, PTA number 666 needs to be updated. We're making these changes. So they created a field in there where it's easier for you to update your privacy threshold analysis. And they've removed the annual requirement as well as for larger projects, they've meshed it into the application portfolio management process with EPMO.
Thank you. So that covers the 4 memos. So now I'm going to tell you a couple of things that we are working on at statewide procurement, and then we'll cover questions. The first one is called AVA.
It stands for Analyzing Vendor Agreements.
We call it AVA. And so it is something that we will hopefully, we are perfecting right now, and it allows us to put documents into AVA, and it tells us what we should be concerned about, what might not meet state law. It is not a substitute for a legal review, but it highlights and helps us maybe streamline the legal review because it highlights key points. I'm not going to go into that in this presentation, but that could very well be the subject of next month's presentation. The other item that we are working on is called the One Form, and we are rolling this out, but right now, we feel your pain. If you're doing an IT procurement, you have to fill out a form to get your PTA completed. You have to fill out a form to submit it to project management. You have to fill out an IT procurement intake form, and then you have to complete your Ariba sourcing project in the tool. What the One Form is going to do is allow us, we'll have a meeting at the very beginning. We'll fill in essentially all the questions for all those forms at one time, and then we complete the form, and it will start the whole process all at once. And our goal is for us to do that at the beginning of the procurement process. Or let's just say that you all of a sudden got $1 million to spend on an upgrade or some type of software program. My recommendation would be for you to immediately complete the One Form, because when that is done with the information that is submitted in the One Form, it works as a prompt and utilizes AI, and it will give you market research, and we can then have a meeting to discuss, okay, this should be your procurement strategy. It should be an RFQ, or we might look at the market research and say, oh, there's already 65 agents or 65 competitors. We can't really do an RFQ because it's a very competitive market. We need to do an RFP. It might say, there's only one person doing this, but there's 6 resellers. So we need to do an IFB based on a waiver for just choosing a vendor. Or an original manufacturer. What I'm saying is we can have that meeting at the beginning of the procurement process. And what I see happen so often is we spend 6 months statewide trying to decide what we want to buy. And then we come to procurement and we try to do an RFQ. Our procurement is the roadblock to us finally making the purchase. And I think by using the One Form, procurement could just be part of the whole process, and we're kind of in there in the beginning, but we'll be in there in the beginning where we're less obtrusive. And usually in this situation, teams will do demos, and a lot of times they do the demos and then they become they come to procurement and say, hey, we want to buy XYZ because they're the best company to help us solve this problem. And we're kind of like, well, you need to do an RFP and meet with to give other companies the opportunity. And then they say, well, we've already did that. We met with 4 vendors and this is the one we chose. Let's make that whole part of the procurement process. So when your operational teams decide who they want, that could be part of the procurement process. And then we'll just make an award. And that'll shave 6 months off of a lot of procurements, because now we're working together to get to the decision instead of being the roadblock at the end. So I guess my message there is, if you have a procurement upcoming that you need to get in the system and it's at the very beginning of the process, reach out, because we are looking for a few more test procurements to put into the OneForm system to make sure everything is working okay. And when we've done it before, it does. You can create the project management piece beforehand. So if you already have a project management number, it works. But if it also works as the entry point for project management. PTA works kind of the same. Oh, and one of the keys is, the first thing it does is tries to make a determination or ask 5 questions to determine whether it's IT or not. Now, we're probably still going to have some that are in that gray area that we'll need to talk about, but at least it gets you down the path. And we are also working with our counterparts over at PNC to have them also work off of the OneForm process, so that optimally you might have just one place that you can go for all state procurements. And the market research can be really helpful. I will jump to questions.
Meredith asked, so under $100,000, the agency makes the decision to when we have to have the vendors agree to the T's and C's, or is there a small purchase delegation like P and C?
That will depend. If it's under 100,000, it depends on your agency purchasing rules. So you just need to, for example, our DIT agency purchasing rules, for just DIT agency, we're currently set up at 25,000 for IT and 29,000 and change, maybe. I think maybe it's just 29 for non-IT. Well, we'll now look to change and see what we want our DIT agency purchasing thresholds to be. So, you have your small purchases, your micro purchases, which would be purchase on a procurement card. Generally, you shouldn't purchase IT stuff using a procurement card because you run into the click wraps and those types of issues, but that applies for non-IT. Then you have your small purchases. That should be covered in your, some agencies might want to stay with the small purchase threshold at 20,000, 25,000, and do competitive bids for anything over 25,000. And then you have your informal bids. So between your small purchases and your sealed competitive bids, you have informal bids, and those usually are done with multiple quotes. So you send a quote out to 3 vendors and you can award to one of those. How you want to conduct procurements under 100,000 just needs to be addressed in your agency procurement manual.
Christine had a question. She was wondering, is there a link to register for Mills Monthly Procurement 101 training?
You can go in and use the search tags. You can put in statewide IT procurement training. You can do intro to IT procurement. You can say DIT procurement, and it'll pop up. Just go into LMS and just search any one of those phrases.
Nicole had a question. If an agency determines small purchase benchmark is up to $100,000, are legal terms and conditions required as it relates to the type of procurement, on-prem, cloud, or software or hardware?
Yes, technically those would be required for $0 up to 100,000. We just haven't looked at them before under 25,000. And what we did notice is that procurements that were what we do notice is that a lot of times there's this misconception that if it's under 25,000, you can just go out and sign any contract. You can sign a vendor contract. And that's not the case at all. All of those need to be reviewed. They need to comply with North Carolina law, and we need to do the due diligence. The only difference is it will be the agency's procurement team's responsibility to document that all that is getting done, and not statewide procurement. But you do need to have those reviewed and make sure, like I said in the presentation, we don't want to sign agreements that has our data going overseas. We want to make sure North Carolina is the jurisdiction of record. We want to make sure the liability limits are aligned. There are some items that could be considered business risks, but so there's business risk, and there's items that are definitely in contradiction to North Carolina state law. The biggest one I know of is the data piece, the data going overseas.
Jake had a question. Is there documentation describing this change that I can share with the BA team? This could be pretty significant update. I mean, the change around how to handle a possible purchaser with a strong idea of what solution they want to buy.
Yeah, so I think I get what you're saying there. When I see the situation, we have the operational teams, and they're always trying to look on ways to improve the system. And if the item is over 100,000, I mean, first off, you got to get a budget item, right? So once they get the budget, I'm hoping that through the one form, the first thing you could do is just steer them to fill out the one form, because that gets the whole process started. If they don't, you still should ask them to come to procurement so you could talk through your procurement strategy, whether you need to do a competitive bid or whether an RFQ would be okay. And we can talk more training here, but that's the key, where we need to start bridging the gap between the agency operational teams who are frustrated with procurement because from their perception, it takes too long to buy everything. And we need to show them the true value of what a good procurement process has to offer. And it's funny, I've had a few times where somebody really wanted to buy something, and it was like, this is the greatest vendor in the world, and we're not going to have any issues with them, and they're perfect. But we insisted on having a good, solid contract in place. For example, if you don't have a scope of work in place with clear deliverables, you could be in trouble if 3 months later, after actually working with the vendor, they come to me and say, God, it turns out these guys are awful. They had great salespeople, but the actual people that work are terrible. They're not doing anything we need to do. Well, if you've got a good scope of work with deliverables, you can hold the vendor accountable. If you just agreed to some agreement the vendor handed it to you, most likely that vendor is just going to collect the money and say thank you, and they'll go on their way. So that's the role of procurement there. And that's what we have to make sure the operational teams know, is that we're there to protect the state's interest and their interest, to make sure that we're actually getting the value when we enter into a contract with a vendor. And in this case, we're talking about contracts for agencies that are under 100,000. That's only a small percentage of our contracts. Most of our contracts are 500,000, $1 million, more than most people's houses. You would never buy a house without a good, solid contract in place. So we shouldn't, we don't want to spend taxpayer money without a good enforceable contract in place.
Jessica had a statement and question. Even with small dollar procurements that are under delegation, we don't agree to a vendor's T's and C's. They are either negotiated with our legal to ensure NC procurement laws are followed, or we encourage them to view their EVP registration where they have already agreed to our terms of use, which connect to the NC general terms and conditions. Is there any further discussion about including the DIT terms and conditions in the terms of use when a vendor registers in the EVP e-procurement based on commodity code?
I'd be in favor of exploring that kind of option. That's a good thought. And also, it's called kind of battle of the forms. Even our PO, we send the vendor our PO, and it says you need to abide by the state of North Carolina terms and conditions. We probably should look at that and even update it more IT oriented. And as you said, based on commodity code, that is something that down the road, I think our office can work on. But you still kind of have battle of the forms, whether, okay, what takes precedence? Is it that PO? Is it the contract that's behind the scene? And we all seen the language in the contract that says what the order of precedence is. But we also get invoices and quotes. I mean, half the time it seems when I see a quote from a vendor, there's a little clause on there that says, by agreeing to this quote, you are agreeing to the vendor's terms and conditions. If you click on that link and go to it, it then says, this is the only terms and conditions that shall apply unless there's another agreement. I mean, there's language that's not usually good for the state and for us. And a lot of times, how do we deal with that? That's what our challenge is as IT procurement professionals. And there's ways I've dealt with it before. Maybe it's kind of a working group we can have. Let's just face it, the risk of a data breach is a huge financial loss. So they're all trying to protect themselves. And we're trying to protect the state. So that's the battle we're facing. And that battle is much different today than it was a year ago, and definitely much different today than it was 10 years ago. Let's keep that conversation going and seeing if we can think of more things like that.
Joy asks, are community colleges now included with all the other state agencies for these purchasing rules?
No, great questions. So there's a community college system office, which we treat like any other agency in the state, that executive agency that reports to the governor. And so they are included under the statewide IT procurement guidance. For individual community colleges, you have to follow state rules, you have to follow state law, but you're not subject to NCDIT review. So you're able to procure on your own. So there's that misconception by not being subject to NCDIT that doesn't really mean you can do whatever you want. It just means that we're not doing a review to make sure you're following all the rules or to help you follow all the rules. And it's the same for universities, which is a little different than PNC, right? PNC has a little bit more coverage in that area. But the reason they do that, if you think of IT as systems, the state has an IT system, but different community colleges have their own IT system. So you should have your own team reviewing the security of the procurements you're purchasing. And that's why it's kind of broken out like that. Well, I was at NC Central, and when we did IT procurements, we had to involve the IT team in the university in all our purchases. And it really wasn't much different than the reviews that we do at the statewide level. It's just, they were just part of the university team.
Elizabeth had a question. Love these trainings. Have you thought of auditing the agencies like DOA and PNC does? You could audit the agencies to see if they have a robust system set up like internal ISO, legal policies and procedures that align with how NCDIT would like to see. Then eventually those agencies who are passing audits could eventually be talked about raising their delegations, etc.
Great question. The answer is we need to get there. When I started at IT procurement, we had this amazing team that just had so much knowledge. The average knowledge on the team was probably 20 or 30 years of procurement experience, but we hadn't added positions. Our procurements had doubled, maybe tripled in the last 5-10 years, but it was the same 17 people, I think, working that team. And man, I could not believe the amount of pressure they were under and stress. And I'm saying that because there was no capacity to do audits and to do things like that. But we've been fortunate in that we've been able to add team. So as we add team, but you know, it's really hard to go out and just get 10 new team members. We're trying that, and Mel's team is trying to work with agencies. Are you on, Mel? You got a question? Or...
Yes. No, I'm going to help you out.
Okay, good.
So part of the training team that, right now is a team of one. So that is part of my role. And one of the things was that we were really trying to get make sure that the agencies were acclimated to the sourcing tool. When I took over the role, sourcing tool was just rolling out. Since then, we went straight into establishing and developing the PGT. So now that both of those things have happened, we are now beginning to start to develop a compliance protocol. And you should see those probably, I would say, by the first of the year.
Yeah, great question. And I wanted to just, add why we hadn't done it yet, because there is a ramping up piece where we're getting more team members and we are adapting to the current realization of what we have. I will say that there are agencies that are really good. We can see it on the dashboard. And we have procurements that are going through in record times, 4 months, 5 months for RFPs. When we do it all right, we can be really good. And we don't have as many procurements that are taking 2 years. I don't know if there's any, but we still have 5 or 6 procurements that have taken over a year. But maybe the good news is we're down to 5 or 6. There used to be 20 or 30. So the pieces are in place for us to succeed much better. And that's what we need. We need to see what agencies are doing really good and what agencies need work.
Warren had a question. Do you have an idea of when the updated IT manual will be pushed out? Is the new IT limit of $100,000 taking the place of the 09 NCAC 06B.1006 IT purchases is considered a small purchase because the total value is less than $25,000?
I'd like to get our manual out in the next 30 to 60 days. The first part. The second part, the administrative code, we are actually working right now on our administrative code, but it's a process that's going to take about a year. So we can't just change it per se. We can't change the administrative code easily, but that's going to take about 1 year to get done. I mean, the administrative code was written before we ever had electronic bids. So, one of the things I always think about is, why do we have a bid opening if we're doing electronic bids? That's just, how is that addressed in modern times when, 20 years ago, all your bids came via FedEx, or was there even a FedEx? They came via the mail or they were hand delivered, and now all bids are electronic. So just the language of a bid opening is somewhat archaic.
The next question from Grant is, will there be a matter of record process through the system?
I actually think where you're getting at, Grant, and the matter of record will be the same as it was before. If your procurement was over $100,000 or over 5 years and you didn't go through SITP, you'll have to, send us the fully executed document, and then we'll do our standard response back to you. It's just that the matter of record bar will be a lot higher. And
Jessica, she's asking, is there any consideration about using the e-forms in Ariba for the STC exception and for the MOR?
We're always looking for things like that to use. That could be a good way to do it. We can definitely look at some ideas like that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Like I said in the beginning, I appreciate everything you do.